Chapter 11, titled Unity and Simplicity, explores the pervasive modern tendency towards simplification and uniformity, contrasting it sharply with the traditional understanding of unity and complexity. Guénon argues that this modern desire for simplicity is not only illegitimate or pernicious, but also a hallmark of a degenerate mentality, leading to profound misunderstandings in various domains. The modern world operates under a pseudo-principle that nature always takes the simplest course. He dismisses this as a perfectly gratuitous postulate, driven by mental laziness, and the desire for things to be easily understandable, reflecting a profane conception of a science that must be within the reach of all, thereby becoming infantile by rigorously excluding profound knowledge. This approach contrasts with the scholastic adage, entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem, which Guénon notes is only legitimately applied in pure mathematics, where concerns are solely quantitative and detached from the effective order of manifestation. In the realm of matters of fact, nature demonstrably exhibits a multitude and prodigious variety far removed from the simplicity modern philosophers impose. Guénon suggests that this modernist drive implicitly seeks to limit universal possibility itself. The pursuit of simplicity and uniformity is often mistakenly equated with unification by modern thinkers. Guénon contends that this is, in fact, an unification upside down, a caricature of unity that is directed towards the lower and substantial pole of existence, which is pure quantity. True unity, he explains, is characterized by essential indivisibility and is not composed of parts. The modern notion of indivisible atoms is a parody of this self-contradictory, because corporeal bodies are inherently extended and indefinitely divisible. In contrast to the simplistic reductionism of the modern mind, Guénon posits that principial unity is of an extreme complexity, eminently containing all the qualitative determinations of manifested beings. The cyclical descent of manifestation involves a progressive simplification as it moves from essence toward substance, leading to increasingly restricted possibilities and a corresponding simplification of the essence of beings, culminating in the complete suppression of every qualitative determination at the level of pure quantity. He uses the Cartesian dualism of spirit and matter as an analogy for this simplification from essence to substance, though he notes these terms are inadequate substitutes. This drive for simplification is alarmingly extended to the spiritual domain, particularly in religious and philosophical contexts. Protestantism is cited as the most typical example, characterized by an almost complete suppression of rights, the dominance of morality over doctrine, and a reduction of doctrine to rudimentary formulas interpretative by anyone. Guénon identifies Protestantism as the only religious production of the modern spirit, emerging when the spirit had not yet entirely rejected religion. Modern reformers frequently claim to be returning to a primitive simplicity, a notion Guénon asserts has never existed except in their imaginations and often serves to mask innovations or reflects their own delusion. This claim also stands in contradiction to their simultaneous espousal of progress. Guénon argues that the origin of all things must be exceedingly complex, as the germ contains the virtuality of all future developments. Through inverse analogy, he states that what is least in quantity must be greatest in quality, referencing the gospel parable of the mustard seed. He stresses that genuine tradition at its origin encompasses the entire doctrine, while human interventions typically restrict and diminish it. The modernist's advocacy for doctrinal simplicity is further linked to the democratic ideal of making science within the reach of all. Consequently, they become declared enemies of all esoterism, which by definition is reserved for an elect and cannot be simple. While exoteric religion should be accessible to all according to their capacity, modernists, by rejecting esoterism, deny the profound significance of religious doctrines, falling into a narrowest and crudest literalism that lacks true spirituality, illustrating Pascal's observation. He who tries to play the angel plays the beast. Guénon acknowledges one specific, albeit negative, sense in which primitive simplicity can be realistically applied: the indistinction of chaos, which is primitive as the substantial base but exists beneath manifestation. This ultimate simplicity, if fully realized, would not be a true return to origins, but an end point of simplification outside of and beneath manifested existence. To resolve this apparent antinomy, Guénon distinguishes between the substantial, beginning from chaos, timeless, and essential, starting point, manifestation, from the essential pole viewpoints. In essence, Chapter 11 portrays the modern world's relentless pursuit of simplification as a descent towards pure quantity, uniformity, and an inverted parody of true unity and spiritual profundity, ultimately leading to a state of profound intellectual and spiritual impoverishment. Chapter 12, titled The Hatred of Secrecy, deeply critiques the modern world's relentless drive toward popularization and its inherent aversion to anything hidden or reserved. Guénon argues that this tendency is a direct consequence of democratic conceptions, aiming to reduce all knowledge to the level of the lowest intelligences. The popularization of knowledge, according to Guénon, results in multiple ineptitudes and a leveling down to the lowest, where quality is systematically sacrificed to quantity. Profane instruction, which is the product of this mentality, lacks true knowledge and profundity. Its most pernicious aspect is its tendency to deny anything superior to itself and to smother all possibilities belonging to a higher domain, fueled by an underlying hatred of all superiority. This drive extends alarmingly to traditional doctrines. Modernists, in their attempts to make such doctrines within the reach of all, inevitably distort them through oversimplification and superficial interpretations. Guénon laments how the modern spirit, through this process, penetrates and dissolves what is fundamentally opposed to it. He identifies a significant confusion between traditional teaching and profane instruction, which is often rebranded as culture. The supposed raising of the general level of culture is, in reality, quite the opposite of preparing individuals for traditional teaching. Instead, it leads to the disappearance of the intellectual elect. He points out the absurdity of trying to popularize profound doctrines like the Vedanta in the current Kali Yuga, as the common man has never been more totally uncomprehending. A core tenet of this modern mentality is its declared enmity towards esoterism. Esoterism, by definition, is reserved for an elect and cannot be simple. Modernists, in rejecting it, deny the profound significance of religious doctrines, falling into a narrowest and crudest literalism that entirely lacks true spirituality. This stands in stark contrast to the modern scientific claim that there are no longer today any scientific secrets, implying that profane science, which operates only on the surface of things, has nothing of value to keep secret or reserve for an elite. Guénon clarifies that true secrecy resides in the inexpressible and incommunicable aspects of transcendent truths. External or contingent secrets, if any, serve only as symbols or disciplines. The modern mentality, unable to grasp this profound nature of secrecy, translates its incomprehension into hostility, viewing any reserve as an illegitimate privilege. This ultimately reflects a hatred for anything that surpasses the level of the average, as well as for everything that holds aloof from the uniformity which it is sought to impose on everyone. The author paints a disturbing picture of the ideal society this mentality seeks to create. A world where everything is public, reducing human beings to an infrahuman level. He imagines people living in hives or glass hives, forced to take meals in common, becoming no more different among themselves than are the individuals of those same species of animals, and perhaps even less so. Chapter 12 concludes by revealing the profound irony: the greatest secret within the modern world itself is the formidable enterprise of suggestion that has actively manufactured the prevailing mentality. This enterprise, with its truly diabolical cleverness, ensures that the modern world remains incapable of perceiving its own manipulation, thereby keeping the secret of its guidance perpetually hidden. Chapter 13, titled The Postulates of Rationalism, thoroughly dissects the foundational principles of modern rationalism, presenting it not as a path to enlightenment, but as a continuous degradation of human understanding, intimately linked to the overarching reign of quantity. Guénon argues that rationalism, by exalting a limited form of reason, systematically denies higher truths and paves the way for a materialistic and quantitative worldview. Guénon traces the origins of modern rationalism to figures like Descartes, noting its direct association from the outset with mechanistic physics. He also suggests that Protestantism, by introducing free inquiry into religion, prepared the ground for this philosophical tendency. The core definition of rationalism, according to Guénon, is a belief in the supremacy of reason, proclaimed as a veritable dogma. This belief, he asserts, necessarily implies the denial of everything that is of a supra-individual order, specifically pure intellectual intuition, and consequently, the exclusion of all true metaphysical knowledge. This denial also extends to the rejection of spiritual authority, which is deemed to derive from a suprahuman source, thus inextricably linking rationalism with individualism. A key consequence of rationalism is its pervasive drive towards simplification. Guénon explains that this simplification operates by reducing everything to its most inferior elements, first suppressing the entire supra-individual domain, and later attempting to bring all remaining elements within the individual order down to the sensible or corporeal modality alone, ultimately reducing them to mere aggregation of quantitative determinations. He points out Descartes' role in this, highlighting his reduction of the spirit to thought and the body to extension, which became the very foundation of mechanistic physics and the starting point for quantitative science. Guénon criticizes Descartes' conception of reason itself as good sense and the most widely shared thing in the world, calling it singularly mediocre and obviously wrong. This view, he argues, wrongly confuses reason in act with mere rationality, which is a specific characteristic of the human being and does not extend beyond the individual domain. Such a flawed understanding leads to notions like the unity of the human spirit, which Guénon dismisses as false, given that true unity cannot belong to the individual domain. He further cites Locke's equally erroneous assertion that man is everywhere and always the same, underscoring the rationalist failure to recognize the qualitative differences between individuals across time and place. Even critics of rationalism like Bergson are noted for their partial insights. Bergson rightly pointed out how reason artificially clips reality by reducing everything to homogeneous or identical, i.e., quantitative elements. He also observed reason's tendency to materialize everything, focusing only on grossest modalities, where quality is at a minimum relative to quantity. However, Guénon notes that Bergson, in seeking remedies, mistakenly turned to the infrarational instead of the suprarational, thus remaining trapped within an individualistic framework. In summation, Guénon concludes that rationalism, by denying any principle superior to reason and isolating reason from the pure and transcendent intellect, inevitably descends towards the inferior pole of existence, plunging ever deeper into materiality. It loses sight of true truth, seeking instead only to make things easy for its own limited comprehension. This inherent downward tendency aligns perfectly with the modern world's drive towards simplification and uniformization of all things, ultimately leading to the reign of quantity. Chapter 14, titled Mechanism and Materialism, systematically traces the philosophical and scientific lineage of these two doctrines, presenting them as inevitable consequences of modern rationalism and integral components of the reign of quantity. Guénon argues that mechanism, initiated by Descartes, paved the way for materialism by progressively limiting human understanding to merely quantitative and superficial aspects of reality. Guénon establishes Cartesian mechanism as the earliest product of rationalism in the scientific sphere, noting its direct association from its inception with the idea of a mechanistic physics. He also points out that Protestantism, with its emphasis on free inquiry, had already prepared the ground for this tendency in the religious domain. Materialism, he clarifies, emerged later, not before the 18th century, but as a direct filiation from mechanism. He distinguishes modern materialism from ancient atomistic conceptions, such as those of Democritus and Epicurus, by stating that while the latter were mechanistic, they lacked the modern physicists' notion of matter, which is central to materialism. A key aspect of Guénon's critique involves understanding materialism as one half of Cartesian dualism. Descartes reduced the spirit to thought and the body to extension, forming the basis of mechanistic physics and quantitative science. Materialism then arose by ignoring or denying the spirit half, effectively reducing all reality to the corporeal dimension to which the mechanistic conception had been applied. This reduction, Guénon notes, extended to making no distinction between inorganic bodies and living beings, leading to the astonishing absurdity of Descartes' animal-machines theory. For humans, dualism fractured the being into two incommunicable parts, making genuine interaction impossible and ultimately allowing the spirit to be ignored. Guénon cites Leibniz's successful demonstration of the insufficiency of mechanistic physics. Leibniz argued that mechanism only grasps the outward appearance of things and is incapable of affording the smallest explanation of their true essence. Mechanism, therefore, possesses a purely representative value rather than an explanatory one. It can describe movement as a change of situation but fails to grasp the reason for movement or its essential or qualitative aspect, which alone provides a real explanation. This limitation is even more pronounced for complex phenomena where quality is predominant over quantity. The inherent tendency of rationalism towards simplification and the reduction of everything to its most inferior elements is central to this degradation. By isolating reason from the pure and transcendent intellect, reason is blinded and tends more and more toward the lowest level, toward the inferior pole of existence, plunging ever more deeply into materiality. This progressive descent means losing hold of the very idea of truth and prioritizing making things as easy as possible for its own limited comprehension. Guénon extends this analysis to the widespread phenomenon of factual materialism. Many individuals, even if they do not explicitly profess materialism, behave as such in practice in all circumstances. This practical materialism is cultivated by a scientific training oriented towards quantitative reduction, leading people to think and act in a uniform way, where differences are minimized and have no more than a minimum of influence in the outer world. This passive acceptance of a materialistic worldview, whether conscious or unconscious, effectively makes individuals full of contradictions yet incapable even of becoming aware of the fact. In summation, Guénon posits that materialism plays a crucial role in anti-traditional action. By denying access to superior possibilities and limiting human perception to the corporeal domain, it prepares humanity for the reign of quantity. This systematic materialization and quantification of existence, even when seemingly opposed by those who profess a religious spirit, ultimately serves to build an exclusively quantitative and as grossly materialistic as it is possible to imagine science and society. The widespread adoption of this mentality signifies that humanity is rapidly approaching the lowest point of the descent in the cyclical manifestation. Chapter 15, titled The Illusion of Ordinary Life, elucidates how a materialistic worldview fundamentally alters human perception and experience, leading to a profound degeneration of existence and a false sense of security. Guénon argues that this ordinary life is not an inherent reality but a construct, a product of the modern spirit's progressive limitation of understanding. Guénon begins by asserting that the materialistic attitude, whether explicit or practical, significantly modifies the psychophysiological constitution of the human being. This leads to a state where modern man becomes quite impermeable to any influences other than such as impinge on his senses, limiting both his comprehension and his field of perception. This restriction then creates a self-justifying, profane point of view, where people see no reason to admit the existence of anything they cannot perceive or conceive, effectively denying anything that would expose the insufficiency and the falsity of their own viewpoint. This narrowed perspective gives rise to the concept of ordinary life or everyday life, which by definition excludes anything purely human that is not explicitly sacred, ritualistic, or symbolical. Such elements, if they are admitted at all, are relegated to an extraordinary domain regarded as exceptional, strange, and unaccustomed. Guénon starkly contrasts this with traditional civilizations, where the profane point of view did not exist and all human activity had a sacred or ritual character. He labels the modern conception as a reversal of the normal order, inevitably leading to an ignorance or a complete denial of the suprahuman. The irony is deepened by the common use of the term real life to describe this ordinary life, which Guénon contends is nothing but the worst of illusions. While the sensible world it encompasses possesses a low-level reality, the conception of it is wholly false because it separates things from their superior principle, thereby denying the very source of their true reality. The degeneration progresses through stages. Initially, some things are seen as inaccessible to traditional influence, then these become normalized. Subsequently, they are considered the only real things, dismissing the suprahuman as unreal. And finally, the human domain is reduced solely to the corporeal modality, with anything suprasensible being deemed unreal. The fact that contemporaries unconsciously use real as a synonym for sensible indicates they have reached this final stage. Guénon connects this philosophical trajectory from Cartesian rationalism's eulogy of good sense, which he sees as mediating ordinary life through humanism to materialism and positivism. Whether explicitly denying the sensible world, materialism, or simply refusing to concern oneself with it, positivism, agnosticism, the outcome is the same, a limitation of reality to the observable and quantifiable. He emphasizes that this is often a practical materialism or positivism, not necessarily a conscious philosophical theory, making it all the more irremediable the less it is deliberate and clearly conscious. The chapter also touches on the loss of the notion of truth, which has been replaced by utility or convenience, reflecting the pragmatism inherent in the modern mentality. This overall materialistic conception serves to further reinforce the very solidification of the world. However, this closed system of the sensible world, which offers an illusion of security, is inherently unstable and precarious. Guénon foreshadows that this security will eventually be troubled by unanticipated interferences, signaling the approach of fissures in this supposedly impenetrable material world. In essence, Chapter 15 reveals ordinary life as a self-imposed prison, a consequence of modern man's self-inflicted intellectual myopia and his progressive disconnection from anything beyond the merely corporeal, ultimately leading to a precarious existence vulnerable to forces it has long denied. Chapter 16, titled The Degeneration of Coinage, serves as a concrete illustration of the broader theme of the modern world's shift from a qualitative to a purely quantitative perspective. Guénon argues that money, which now appears to be a quintessential symbol of the reign of quantity, originally possessed a far different, qualitative, and even sacred character. Guénon begins by asserting that the economic point of view and the exclusively quantitative conception of money are recent products of a degeneration. Historically, money at its origin, and for a long time thereafter, held a truly qualitative value. This is evidenced by ancient coins being literally covered with traditional symbols, often bearing profound meanings. For instance, among the Celts, symbols on coins could only be explained by the intervention of druids, implying direct spiritual involvement in the monetary domain. Such practices confirm that in strictly traditional civilizations, a profane point of view did not exist, and money was not the secular object it is today. Many traditions speak of coinage as being charged with a spiritual influence, whose effectiveness was tied to the symbols it bore. Even in recent times, vestiges of this notion could be found in religious devices on coins, though their real symbolical value was lost. The control of money by spiritual authority was not limited to antiquity, extending in the Western world until the end of the Middle Ages, when the West still maintained a traditional civilization. Guénon cites accusations against sovereigns for debasing the coinage as proof that they were not freely able to alter currency standards without overstepping the temporal power's recognized rights. Such an accusation would be meaningless if the coinage's importance were merely conventional or material. Instead, it indicated the usurpation of prerogatives belonging to the spiritual authority, the one authentic source of all legitimacy. This historical fact underscores that money in traditional societies had aspects quite unknown to the modems. The profanization of money is part of a broader movement where all human activities have been divested of their sacred or traditional character, reducing human existence to the third-rate mediocrity of ordinary life. This process is largely achieved by reducing things to their quantitative aspect alone. The modern inability to conceive of money as anything other than a simple quantity is a prime example. This reduction, particularly through modern industry's products, compels man into the narrow circle of ordinary life, as in a prison without escape. In contrast, traditional objects served as supports for meditation, connecting individuals to something beyond the merely corporeal. The degeneration of coinage is also reflected in the qualitative degeneration of language and valuation. The worth of an object is now ordinarily estimated only in terms of its price, a numerical quantity of money. The word estimate itself, which once held both qualitative and quantitative meanings, has lost its former sense. Similarly, the worth of a man is estimated according to his wealth. This is paralleled by the word value, leading to philosophical theories that conceive everything quantitatively. This linguistic degradation shows that a world attempting to reduce all things to quantity must necessarily use a purely quantitative language. Furthermore, Guénon notes a peculiar phenomenon. Since money lost its guarantee of a superior order, its actual quantitative value, or purchasing power, has been ceaselessly less and less. He suggests that as this trend approaches its limit, money may lose all justification for its existence, even practical or material, and disappear of itself. This curious turn of events signifies that the extreme reduction to pure quantity ultimately leads to a real dissolution. This demonstrates the precariousness of ordinary life and reaffirms that the ultimate goal of the quantitative tendency is the final dissolution of the present world. In essence, Chapter 16 powerfully uses the example of money to illustrate how modern materialism, by stripping things of their qualitative and sacred aspects, leads to a diminished understanding of reality, a degradation of human experience, and an inherent instability that presages the world's ultimate dissolution. Chapter 17, titled The Solidification of the World, directly addresses how the modern materialistic worldview is not merely a philosophical stance, but a reflection and a reinforcing agent of a profound cosmic and human transformation. Guénon argues that the world itself and human perception within it has undergone a progressive materialization or solidification as part of the ongoing cyclical descent. Guénon begins by establishing the intrinsic connection between the human and cosmic orders, stating that they are closely bound together and each continuously reacts on the other. This means that the cosmic manifestation, along with human mentality, follows a descending course away from primal spirituality. This descent is characterized as a progressive materialization of the cosmic environment itself. It is only when this materialization reaches a certain stage, already very marked, that the materialistic conception can arise in man as its correlative, aligning with the attitude of ordinary life. A central argument of the chapter is the illusory nature of the modern idea of matter. Guénon contends that this concept expresses an unattainable limit, as matter is conceived as purely quantitative and inert. A world with truly inert things would cease to exist, rendering the idea of matter as illusory as it could possibly be, corresponding to no reality of any kind. Consequently, the mechanical laws formulated by modern science are always mere approximations, unable to grasp all elements, even when such elements are supposedly at a minimum. This approximation, however, allows the sensible world to appear as a closed system. The term solidification is introduced as fundamentally synonymous with materialization, but perhaps more precise and realistic, given that solid bodies most strongly create the illusion of materiality. Guénon links this to Bergson's observation that the solid constitutes the true domain of reason, particularly in its scientific application. Crucially, this actual occurrence of solidification is presented as the true reason modern science succeeds in its practical applications, not because its theories are true, they change all the time and remain false, but because the world itself has become more amenable to such a quantitative approach. In earlier, less solid periods, modern industry would have been completely impossible. This solidification also explains why many fabulous things of antiquity are unimaginable today. This process of materialization has led to a loss of human faculties that once allowed man to transcend the sensible world, modifying his psychophysiological constitution. Modern science, born from these conditions, claims to expand the known world, but in fact it has shrunken both the world and man to mere corporeal entities, cutting off communication with other orders of reality. Furthermore, man is not merely a passive observer. His materialistic conceptions actively reinforce the world's solidification, and cosmic reactions indeed change according to man's attitude. Aspects of reality conceal themselves from those adopting a profane and materialistic viewpoint, seemingly confirming their beliefs, but actually being a direct consequence of those very conceptions. This results in the sensible world appearing as a completely closed and increasingly solid system, fostering the illusion that ordinary life can progress smoothly like a well-regulated mechanism. However, Guénon warns that this solidification can never be complete, as reaching its extreme would be incompatible with any real existence. Moreover, the further it progresses, the more precarious it becomes, as the lowest reality is also the least stable, evidenced by the ever-growing rapidity of the changes taking place in the world today. This instability inevitably leads to the development of fissures in this imagined closed system, signaling that its unstable equilibrium is on the point of being interrupted. Guénon notes that materialism and mechanism are, in a sense, already relegated to the past, as the very notion of matter is fading away. This fading, however, is not a cause for optimism, but rather yet one more step toward final dissolution. In summary, Chapter 17 posits that the modern world's quantitative and materialistic nature is both a product and a perpetuator of a cosmic solidification, which, while giving the illusion of security and enabling certain technological successes, ultimately leads to a diminished human experience and an inherently unstable reality destined for dissolution. Chapter 18, titled Scientific Mythology and Popularization, delves into the nature of modern scientific theories and their profound, often detrimental, influence on the public mentality. Guénon argues that modern science, rather than offering true knowledge, constructs hypothetical and constantly changing theories that, when popularized, solidify into a scientific mythology, further entrenching the quantitative worldview and leading towards intellectual and cosmic dissolution. Guénon begins by asserting that modern profane science, particularly when it moves beyond mere observation, constructs purely hypothetical theories. These theories are deemed inherently hypothetical because they originate from an empirical starting point, where facts, being indefinite in multitude, can never fully guarantee the truth of any single theory. Furthermore, these hypotheses are often more influenced by preconceived ideas and prevailing modern tendencies than by experimental results. The rapid abandonment and replacement of these theories by scientists themselves underscore their lack of solidity and true explanatory value. Scientists, especially physicists, often regard these constructions as mere representations or manners of speaking, acknowledging their conventional character and unreality. The danger, however, lies in the popularization of these theories. When presented to the public at large through elementary teaching and popular works, these hypotheses are stripped of their provisional nature and simplified into resolutely assertive forms. The public, uncritically accepting them as dogmas, embraces these scientific notions often long after they have been discarded by the scientific community. Guénon explicitly states that this scientific mythology serves to oppose and be substituted for religious dogmas, citing evolutionary theories as a prime example. This process contributes to a mentality that readily accepts the strangest contradictions. A crucial aspect of this chapter is the extravagant misapplication of scientific concepts, particularly their transposition from the corporeal to the subtle or suprasensible domain. Guénon observes that the phantasmagoria of neo-spiritualism often derives from such misapplications, which involve a materialization of the suprasensible. Early examples include the 18th century concept of fluids, e.g. animal magnetism, used to explain physical forces, which was then carried over from the corporeal order into the subtle order. Even though a fluid might seem opposite to a solid, Guénon argues that this conceptualization embodies things that really belong to subtle manifestation. He notes the anachronism of self-proclaimed progress-minded spiritualists still believing literally in fluids even after physicists abandoned the notion. Modern equivalents, such as waves and radiations in radiesthesia, continue this trend, representing psychic influences in a crudely corporeal manner, demonstrating an incapacity to conceive of anything whatsoever outside the domain of the formation of mental images of sensible things. The delirium of the fourth dimension is highlighted as another manifestation of this scientific mythology. Guénon critiques hypergeometry as an algebraic construction misinterpreted by those lacking sufficient mathematical knowledge, warning of the dangers of popularization. Psychists and occultists literalize the fourth dimension to explain subtle phenomena, further materializing the suprasensible and indicating a step toward disintegration as occultism and modern science converge. Chapter 18 concludes by linking these phenomena to the broader themes of solidification and dissolution. While the solidification of the world allowed modern science to achieve practical successes, it also limited human faculties and conceptual understanding to the purely corporeal. However, the very notion of matter, so central to this solidification, is now fading away and dissolving in scientific theory. Guénon sees this not as a positive development but as yet one more step toward final dissolution. The chapter thus portrays modern science and its popular misinterpretations as active agents in the modern world's descent toward chaos by reducing reality to the quantitative, promoting illusory understandings, and inadvertently opening doors to inferior subtle influences that facilitate disaggregation. Chapter 19, titled The Limits of History and Geography, elucidates how the modern, quantitative, and materialistic worldview fundamentally distorts the understanding of both past human civilizations and the physical world itself. Guénon argues that modern profane science is inherently limited by its inability to perceive qualitative differences in time and space, leading to a uniformizing and simplistic comprehension of reality. Guénon begins by stressing the qualitative differences between periods of time, which cause corresponding changes in the cosmic and terrestrial environment. Modern science, being a product of the present special conditions, cannot conceive of different historical realities. Consequently, historians and psychologists project their contemporary mentality onto the past, assuming that ancient peoples thought and acted like modern individuals, leading to simplified and uniformizing conceptions. This outlook ignores the fact that different phases of a cycle possess unique qualities that influence events. A key point is the existence of barriers in history that modern researchers cannot overcome. Guénon notes that modern history, properly so called, only effectively begins around the 6th century BCE, beyond which chronology becomes imprecise and ancient. Civilizations are incomprehensible due to the lack of contemporary points of reference. Any vestiges of bygone periods discovered by archaeologists, Guénon explains, have inevitably participated in the solidification of the world and are perceived through modern eyes, which are attuned only to the coarsest modality of manifestation. This materialization of the world prevents modern man from conceiving of phenomena that were considered fabulous but were once real for the ancients. The same limitations apply to geography. Guénon asserts that ancient geographical descriptions often differ so markedly from modern ones that it is difficult to believe they refer to the same places. This discrepancy is not due to the ancients' inability to see clearly, but rather the moderns' failure to perceive the qualitative aspects of space. Modern geography, emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries alongside the rationalist mentality, marks a period where human faculties of conception and perception became totally atrophied, confining man's understanding to the coarsest and most inferior mode of reality. In contrast, Guénon introduces the concept of sacred or traditional geography, a knowledge entirely unknown to moderns. This traditional view recognizes that space is not homogeneous but qualified, meaning certain places are inherently suited to serve as support for beneficial spiritual influences like oracles or pilgrimage sites, or conversely, malefic, subtle influences. Modern man, due to the density of his psycho-physiological constitution, experiences nothing particular in such places, rendering these realities non-existent for him. Regarding accounts of strange beings in ancient records, Guénon suggests these could stem from misunderstood symbolism, manifestations of subtle entities from other domains, or even descriptions of corporeal species now extinct. The modern tendency to dismiss such accounts as superstitions or primitive imagination reflects an incurable blindness born of their profane, materialistic prejudices. Ultimately, Chapter 19 highlights an abyss separating traditional science from profane science, even when they bear the same names, noting that the latter is merely a degenerate residue of the former. Modern man's rejection of anything that surpasses his limited investigations, while boasting of superiority, is seen as a clear symptom of the pervasive intellectual myopia characteristic of the modern and scientistic mentality. This deep-seated incomprehension of qualitative realities in both history and geography serves to reinforce the illusion of a self-contained, purely quantitative world, further entrenching humanity in its current state of decadence. In Chapter 20, From Sphere to Cube, Guénon employs geometrical symbolism to illustrate the solidification of the world and the profound cyclical descent that characterizes our current Manvantara, or world age. This chapter reveals how the understanding of cosmic manifestation shifts from a primordial qualitative state to a terminal, quantitative one, moving from the boundless potentiality of the sphere to the rigid fixity of the cube. Guénon establishes the sphere as the primordial and most universal form, representing the initial, undifferentiated state of manifestation. It is described as the least specified of all, containing within itself the global integrality of all possibilities in their first and embryonic state. This spherical form is associated with the egg of the world, and, in relation to our present cycle, belongs to the realm of subtle manifestation, which precedes and acts as the principle for gross manifestation. Guénon notes that a perfect sphere is never truly realized in the corporeal world, as celestial bodies, for instance, follow elliptical paths, indicating a first specification of the circle. Symbolically, the sphere is related to heaven and the essential pole of existence. In stark contrast, the cube represents the most arrested and specified form, symbolizing the end of the cycle and the maximum point of solidification. It is intrinsically linked to the earth as the terminating and final element of corporeal manifestation, corresponding to the stopping point of the cyclical movement. The cube embodies stability through immobility, akin to minerals, and serves as an inverted reflection at the lowest point of the principial immutability of the highest point. It is the symbol of the substantial pole and the base, or foundation, with its faces oriented along the three dimensions of space, indicating its measurement and effective realization in integrality. The relationship between heaven and earth is analogously represented by spherical/circular forms and cubic/square forms, respectively, paralleling the duality of Purusha and Prakriti, essence and substance. The core of the chapter lies in this gradual transition from sphere to cube, which geometrically figures the world's progressive solidification. Guénon explains that what was interior and central in the sphere is, so to speak, turned inside out to become the surface or the exteriority of the cube. This transformation is further illustrated by the symbolism of the terrestrial paradise at the cycle's beginning, which is circular, and the heavenly Jerusalem at its end, which is square. The circular boundary of the terrestrial paradise, representing the primordial spherical form, eventually changes into a square. This squaring of the circle is presented as an insoluble problem for those unaware of its symbolic meaning, as its realization occurs only at the end of the cycle. The square signifies the accomplishment of the possibilities that were germinal in the circle, now fixed and stabilized in a state of definition, akin to a crystallization into a city with mineral symbolism, contrasting with the initial garden with vegetable symbolism. The symbolism extends to the instruments used to draw these forms, the compass and the square. The compass is depicted in traditional art, like William Blake's Ancient of Days, as measuring the bounds of heaven and earth, representing the great architect of the universe, or spirit of universal construction. Guénon explains that this solidification has a double meaning. From the perspective of the descending cycle towards quantity and materiality, it carries an unfavorable or sinister significance, opposing spirituality. However, it is simultaneously a necessary process preparing for the ultimate fixation of the cycle's positive results in the form of the heavenly Jerusalem. These results, once fixed, will then be transmuted into the germs of the possibilities of the future cycle, necessitating the intervention of a transcendent principle to restore the primordial state and usher in a new heaven and a new earth for the next Manvantara. The wheel stops turning when the circular form metaphorically becomes square, marking the end of time and the merging of all temporal aspects into an essential unity. In essence, Chapter 20 powerfully conveys Guénon's view that the modern world's increasing quantification and materialization are not random, but a natural, albeit terminal phase of a cosmic cycle, moving from a flexible, qualitative origin to a rigid, quantitative end, symbolically represented by the irreversible transition from sphere to cube.